Abraham Lincoln warned that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. Would you like to know what's being taught in today's classrooms? Welcome to Say What? With attorney Mark Schneider and Pastor George Rosca Jr. They'll explore the issues facing children, parents, and society as a result of the public schools and the forces behind them. Say What is the radio program of Protect Our Kids, which seeks to inform and equip concerned citizens about the looming crisis in American education. So listen in as your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr. unpack the issues and organizations affecting our children. And now here's your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr.
Hello, everyone. I'm George Rosca.
And I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 160 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including the Biden administration's endorsement of the Transgender Day of Visibility, which we started talking about in our last episode 159. And we're going to continue to dissect the president's message that was loud and clear, but it was also very confusing and not so compelling for us because it lacked a lot of much needed evidence to the grave accusations he was making.
Yeah, and as we noted, George, last week, it was not by accident that he decided to make this announcement on Easter. The Day of Visibility has been around since 2010, so it's not something new. But the Biden administration is the first presidential administration to actually be actively supporting it and making public announcements every year, including on Easter, the holiest day of the year, for a large component of the American population. And during his address, they made a fancy video along with posts on Facebook and X and other social media sites. He made a number of statements that we started to cover last week, one of which is there's been an epidemic of violence against transgender women of color and girls of color, for which there's no evidence for that at all. He urged that we pass the Equality Act, which we've talked about on this program before as being extremely dangerous for civil liberties in this country. He said that to parents of transgender children, affirming your child's identity is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep them health and safety. And we spent the majority of last week refuting this claim by citing evidence from various medical clinics, practitioners, studies, not just here in America, but overseas as well, saying exactly the opposite, that is actually a very dangerous thing to be doing. And finally, George, he said that transgenders are made in the image of God. So the president used an illustration and a truth, actually, from biblical scripture, because they are made in the image of God. But he went further than that by saying that, essentially saying that because they're transgender, they are deserving of dignity and support. In fact, he emphasized that word, dignity. And so, George, we thought it would be valuable to walk our listeners through what that term really entails. It's a code word, particularly in America's legal culture, and it's got a fairly notorious past for changing our culture quite dramatically. And I will start with the appeal to dignity that goes back 20 years, because, George, it was the same appeal to, quote, this word dignity that was used to outlaw anti-sodomy laws that had been on the books in this country for over a century. And this goes back to the case in 2003 of Lawrence v. Texas, where Anthony Kennedy actually wrote the majority opinion outlawing anti-sodomy laws in that state and across the union. This is what he said, quote, "These matters," referring to sodomy, "involving the most intimate and personal choices a person may make in a lifetime, choices central to personal dignity and autonomy," which means self-law, "are central to the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment." Now, we could spend the entire broadcast unpacking that one statement, but I just wanted to raise it, George, by showing that that word was memorialized in a Supreme Court decision to justify getting rid of a law that had been on the books for over a century. Yeah. And it doesn't stop there, because 5 years later, as you might remember, California had the battle to retain the definition of traditional marriage in the state. In 2008, there was a proposition to memorialize the definition of marriage as being between one man and one woman. Well, obviously, the voters at that time, surprisingly, voted from a 52 to 48 percentage endorsing the definition of marriage as being traditional, and the courts turned it over. But in their decision, George, and this is a famous case, it's called In Re Marriage Cases. This was a case in California. A dignity was used to find a right to same-sex marriage in California. Here's what the justice said in the ruling. One of the core elements of this fundamental right to marry is the right of same-sex couples to have their official family relationship accorded the same dignity as those accorded to all other officially recognized family members. And George, this same term was used years later in the famous now case of Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court case in 2015 that made same-sex marriage the law of the land. And I guess not surprisingly, George, it was the same Justice, Anthony Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion for this ruling, where he again stated, the fundamental liberties protected in the 14th Amendment due process clause extend to certain personal choices central to individual dignity and autonomy.
This is shocking. This is shocking for me, Mark. This word is being misused.
It really is being misused, because the obvious question, George, is by what standard do we dignify people's actions? If human dignity is merely subjective, what meaning should we attach to it? Why should society dignify same-sex marriage, let alone identifying with a non-biological gender and demanding that everybody else recognize that gender as well? You will find hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe millions of pages and articles, treatises, publications, and legal opinions demanding that we do dignify it. But you will never find, you'll have a very difficult time finding why it should be dignified. The closest thing that I've seen to that answer came again from Justice Kennedy, who was a Catholic, by the way. In that case, Lawrence v. Texas, and he borrowed language from a famous abortion-related case known as Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where he wrote in a language is now famous or infamous, depending on your worldview. And this is what it says. This is what he wrote. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mysteries of human life. In other words, George, because people have a right to define themselves, this is why dignity should be afforded to them. And you notice that word autonomy, which means self-law. This is completely anti-biblical concept. And the Judeo-Christian worldview has been the predominant worldview that led to the creation of America, the Declaration of Independence, the very formation of our Constitution, separation of powers, the idea of federalism. It's being turned on end. I would argue it has been turned on end by these gradations of court decisions, and now by the Biden administration's announcement on the Transgender Day of Visibility, again citing dignity. So, if on the other hand, as President Biden declares, men and women really are created imago Dei in God's image, then human dignity is directly tied to God's character, including his design for gender, intimacy, and marriage. So he completely misapprehends the meaning of what it means to be made in the image of God and twist it around to something that is really quite sinister.
Yeah, I mean, without God, we can ascribe whatever meaning we want to any word, because words don't have meaning anymore. So this whole concept of dignity, how President Biden tied it to the image of God, that's true. But how he wants to redefine it to mean whatever he wants it to be, giving himself the autonomy to do that apart from God, that is not true.
That's exactly right. And it was pretty interesting, George. I think that the same week that they came out with the Transgender Day of Visibility announcement, the Vatican released its Dignitas Infinita, which means infinite dignity. And this was 5 years in the making, by the way, approved by the Pope. It was released March the 25th. The declaration specifically calls gender theory and sex change therapies grave violations of human dignity. Now, I thought Mr. Biden was a Catholic. The statement further says, all attempts to obscure reference to the ineliminable sexual difference between men and women are to be rejected. We cannot separate the masculine and the feminine from God's work of creation, which is prior to all our decisions and experiences, and where biological elements exist which are impossible to ignore. It follows that any sex change intervention, as a rule, risks threatening the unique dignity the person has received from the moment of conception. George, that's a correct understanding of what dignity is and where it comes from.
Well, and the Biden administration continues to press things forward according to their own worldview, because they're committed to advancing transgender equality in the classroom, which is one of our biggest concerns at POK. On the playing field, at work, in our military, that should be a concern for all of our citizens, because that's the last type of person you want defending you. In our housing and healthcare system, everywhere, simply everywhere. That's quoting President Biden. And you know what? They do really mean it. They are pushing for all of this stuff in all spheres of our culture.
Few Americans realize how deep this goes and how transformative it will be for the United States. I mean, people are probably wondering, what's happened to this country? How did we end up here? Well, George, change happens gradually before it happens suddenly. It's like a cancer, it's very small when it begins in the body. It's unseen, and it's doing its work silently until it's metastasized, and now the entire body is at risk. This is the same kind of thing. But as we've reported in our conferences and speaking engagements, all the way going back to 1993, LGBT activists were promoting for the transformation of society. Here's one quote from Paula Edelbrook. She's now deceased, but she was a very prominent LGBT activist. She said this: being queer is more than setting up house, sleeping with a person of the same gender, and seeking state approval for doing so. Being queer means pushing the parameters of sex, sexuality, and family, and in the process, George, transforming the very fabric of society. 1993.
And that was their goal all along. We just didn't listen.
And another LGBT activist, Daniel Villarreal, in a book or an article, Can We Please Just Start Admitting, in 2011 wrote, they accuse us of exploiting children. In response, we say, no, we're not going to make kids learn about homosexuality. We swear, but let's face it, he wrote, that's a lie.
Bingo.
They knew exactly what they were doing. It was part of the effort. SIGUS, one of the biggest promoters of LGBT sexual gender identity curriculums in K through 12 public education. Their tagline for their entire organization is sex ed for social change. Full stop. That's the reason for it.
And they've been around for decades. But now, as you mentioned, Mark, gradual versus sudden, all of a sudden, all of these organizations start to really come out with what they're truly about.
So, I mean, George, aside from this being a repudiation of the natural order, it has affected science, our legal history, the family structure, what family means, what it means to be a human being itself. This worldview recognizes no authority and worships at the altar of self-absorption. This is where this word dignity comes from, in self-autonomy, according to Justice Kennedy. All law is based on some moral understanding of right and wrong. Western laws against the sins of abortion, adultery, sodomy, and same-sex marriage were moral crimes based on a biblical or Judeo-Christian worldview. But with America's rejection of that worldview and its embrace of paganism, what were once crimes are now not only legally protected and celebrated. Under the new pagan moral code, punishment is actually meted out against those still holding to those old virtues.
And that's what the Equality Act is all about, really to bring that full force of the law to be able to punish people who are not going to bow the knee.
That's right.
To this new morality. I don't know what else to call it. Morality based on a pagan worldview.
That's exactly right, George. Well, as part of the Day of Visibility, the White House put out, in fact, it was put out last year, on March the 31st, 2023, a fact sheet. It's entitled White House Honors Transgender Day of Visibility. And it's quite long. It's very detailed, and we don't have time to go into the whole thing today, but we thought we would highlight some of the goals of the president's platform for the Day of Visibility. The ostensible reasons that they give for the need for this document have been discredited. And they talk about health problems and discrimination and rejection for people that identify as trans. They citing overwhelming scientific evidence that affirming the LGBTQI plus child is in their best interest, that we've completely refuted. Most of these studies that they cite in this document are completely self-serving. And studies in general, we think, need to be taken with a grain of salt. You can manipulate and choose these studies to suit whatever your conclusion is.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what's happened here. But we won't go into detail about what we covered last week. But in this fact sheet, it announces specific steps to advance the LGBT worldview. And here's just a few of them. The U.S. Office of Personnel Management Guidance regarding gender identity and inclusion in the federal workplace will administrate certain policies like legal name changes, names and pronouns, OSHA requirements for supporting transgender sanitation needs in restrooms, changing rooms, and showers. This is across the country, not just in public schools.
Yep.
Workplace requirements to support transitioning individuals, updating workplace appearance and dress policies, the policing of new anti-discrimination policies. It talks about disparaging conversion therapy. Again, we would ask, under what moral, spiritual, or scientific basis are they refuting and disparaging conversion therapy? Conversion therapy got a lot of news a number of years ago. It's currently banned in some 26 states. It's gotten a bad rap, and they've gotten the results already that they've wanted, because if a person is having difficulty and they're wondering, do I really want to transition to a different gender than my biological sex? Now in 26 states, it's absolutely against the law for a counselor to come in and help you get comfortable with your biological sex.
Yeah, and California led the way with Assembly Member Evan Lowe back in 2018, 2019 to do that here. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
Here's another one from the fact sheet. Intervening legally where states violate the rights of transgender youth and their families. Okay, so what does that mean? These are states that are passing laws precluding gender-affirming care for minors. And the good news, George, is that there are 19 states and counting that have relied on accurate and legitimate scientific studies to show the damage that gender-affirming care does. So now the Biden administration has made it their core platform that they're going to come against these states and do everything they can to overturn these laws.
Yeah, I mean, and for example, in Alabama and Arkansas, these are temporarily blocked, again, going through the court system. Right. And the Department of Justice is always filing these amicus briefs on behalf of these lawsuits. So they're really doing everything in their power just to continue pushing their worldview.
Another goal is directing agencies to strengthen LGBTQ rights. Within hours of taking office, President Biden signed an executive order committing federal agencies to enforce civil rights protections, meaning special privileges, for LGBTQ plus Americans in federally funded housing, healthcare, education, employment, credit and lending, nutrition, and criminal justice programs. So, George, across the spectrum.
And he continues to go on and say that we're going to be fighting for the passage of the Equality Act. And so this call to action from the president, is all about what was called H.R. 5, which is really to expand the definition of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So this whole SOGI would now be ingrained in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and make it into a protected class under federal code. We've mentioned what that would do to freedom of religion. Even freedom of speech, one of the most basic and fundamental things and rights of every human being. And we've already been seeing and tracking all of these pronoun lawsuits that are working their way through state courts and through the federal courts as well. Thankfully, most of those have been, going our way and are reasonable. But this is what the Equality Act would bring. It would bring the full force of the federal government to basically punish those who don't want to lie.
Yeah, this is a law that's been promoted for well over a decade now. It comes up virtually every year, and fortunately, good sense in Congress has kept it in abeyance. But the Biden administration just keeps pushing it. And if this would be enacted, George, it would imperil religious freedom, substantially harm women and girls, and cement a false conception of the human person into our nation's laws and consciousness. Not to mention the fact that it would effectively destroy the clear, biologically determined distinctions between males and females in our entire society and legal system. So this is one of the worst pieces of legislation that we've seen. Well, another goal of this fact sheet is ensuring transgender Americans can access accurate IDs and vital government services, which means offering U.S. passports with a gender-neutral marker, improving the travel experience, their words, not mine, improving the travel experience for transgender people and to improve their dignity. There's that magic word again. So I don't even know what that means. Is there a special seat for you or a section on a plane or a train or on the highway? Do you get your own lane? I'm not sure what that means, George.
I don't even know if certain countries in this world are going to accept you to travel there with that kind of a passport.
Yeah, we'll find out. Another goal, the presidential platform, helping non-binary workers who file employment discrimination complaints. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission implemented changes to make it easier for non-binary workers to accurately identify their gender identity when filing a charge of workplace discrimination. So this really empowers the EEOC on seek and destroy missions for people that don't identify and resist the LGBTQ worldview.
Another one is addressing the crisis of homelessness among transgender Americans. And we've seen what a perfect utopia California is when it comes to addressing homelessness and the billions of dollars that have been funneled into these pet projects of these politicians. But basically what this would do is it'd be enforcing fair housing protections that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, including gender identity, promoting safe and equal access to housing and shelter for transgender people, and especially transgender youth, because we're seeing in California how they're trying to create housing for this segment of the population. The federal government is that their job? Is the state government's job to get into housing and provide housing for all? I mean, that just reminds me of communism in Romania.
Yeah, there's a recent expose that's gone viral about California not being able to account for $25 billion it's spent over a number of years on the homeless problem. We have no idea where that money has gone. California has probably the worst homeless record in the country. But now the Biden administration is doubling down by saying we're going to give special rights to people that identify with the LGBT worldview in housing. I don't know what this means. They don't give details on this, but this is one of the goals. Here's another one, George. Advancing health equity and expanding access to gender-affirming health care. So this means bolstering access to gender-affirming care, despite the enormous evidence that this is incredibly damaging with lifelong consequences. Combating HIV among transgender and gender diverse communities, partnering with transgender communities to end the monkeypox, or what's called Mpox, viral outbreak transmitted through sexual contact. I had never heard of this before.
Same here.
But apparently this is a thing now in certain communities. Mpox complications can include severe scars on the face, arms, and legs, blindness, other infections, and in some rare cases, death. So, if you practice safe sex, I think you could probably avoid this, but this administration is doubling down to provide special care for these kinds of needs.
And another one, advancing transgender equality at home and around the world. And I think this is where we start to infuriate some nations, because advancing transgender equality in U.S. foreign policy, President Biden signed a memorandum of advancing the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons around the world, and he's directing agencies engaged abroad to ensure the United States diplomacy and foreign assistance promote and protect human rights of LGBTQI plus people. So this means basically supporting trans-led organizations and individuals, basically the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, the DBE program, that which has been around for decades, would show special favoritism to trans-led businesses as well. They're even hosting the UN Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity for an official visit to the United States. That means they're pushing a lot of this through the United Nations, through the World Health Organization, and all of these international organizations where the U.S. is forking out a lot of money to fund these organizations in comparison to all of its other member world, countries that are part of that. The U.S. is actually one of the biggest financiers of LGBTQ movements across the globe.
America now has taken the lead in promoting this worldview across the globe, and the Biden administration is at the vanguard of this effort. This is from the memorandum. Quote, all human beings should be treated with respect and dignity, there's that word again, and should be able to live without fear no matter who they are or who they love. This word dignity is used as a talisman, George. It sort of ends all arguments. Nobody asks the question, well, what is dignity? Where does it come from? What is it based on? What does it even mean? No matter who they are or whom they love, is that the criteria now for affording a person dignity? Does that apply to men who love boys or polyamorous unions? Does it apply to people who identify as a kangaroo? If it's all about self-identification, then you would expect that dignity would have to be afforded to you. There's not a lot of critical thinking or deep thought behind these statements. Through this memorandum, the Biden administration says, I am directing all agencies engaged abroad to ensure the United States diplomacy and foreign policy assistance promote and protect the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons. Official United States policy.
Well, and they continue to say that they were going to be supporting transgender public servants. And that's interesting because, supporting a federal workplace where all employees' gender identities and expressions are affirmed and respected without fear of discrimination or retribution or disadvantage. In fact, back in June of 2021, President Biden signed this executive order directing historic new steps to ensure the federal government is a model employer for all Americans and individuals of gender identities, including transgender, gender, non-conforming, and non-binary employees. And one of the ways that it was trying to do that and show that it was meaning what it's actually promoting is that they were appointing transgender leaders at a historic pace. And a lot of that just fell flat on its face.
Yeah, I mean, the two notable examples are Dr. Rachel Levine, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness, and Sam Brinton, who I think was in the Department of Transportation. I may be wrong, but he was arrested as a felon for stealing stuff, I think, in an airport.
Women's hand luggages.
That's what it was. And then finally, George, I mean, there are many, many more. We encourage our listeners to read the document themselves, but here's another one. Promoting visibility and inclusion for transgender Americans. Do you think that's really needed? You cannot escape it. It is everywhere. President Biden became the first U.S. president to issue a proclamation commemorating the Transgender Day of Visibility. The White House has consistently uplifted the voices of transgender Americans. This is their boast. Mm-hmm. The White House press secretary hosted a first-of-its-kind national conversation on equality with transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary Americans. And the White House released a toolkit with best practice for advancing inclusion, opportunity, and safety for transgender Americans. In 2022, Ashton Moda, a teenager and advocate for transgender rights, introduced President Biden at the White House's Pride celebration. So, George, we could go on and on, but this is the most radical administration in United States history. And he's got another year in office, basically. If he gets reelected, then that's, 4+ years more of this worldview being promoted in ways that I don't think you and I can even imagine right now.
Well, parents, I think it's up to us to be informed and take action. Take action to protect your kids. You can go on our website at pok.org to find out more information about what you could do. We have extensive videos on the triple threat, sex and gender theory, critical race theory, and social emotional learning. You can also go visit us on Facebook, X, Instagram, share our content there. But most importantly, it's what do you do with your own children? Our message at POK is get out now, because the public school system is a threat to our children. And just from the topics that we discussed today and in the last episode, with this push of gender affirming care, and in fact what is happening across the world, and just the horrors of gender affirming care, even though it sounds like a good term, and the way that it's mutilating our children. So we encourage you to please share our content, listen to our podcast, share our podcasts on Spotify, on iTunes, and on other platforms. You can invite Mark and I to come and speak at your group or your church. And if you want to partner along with us to continue advancing the mission of POK, you can also donate by clicking the red donate button on our website. We thank you for listening and for watching our podcasts, and we will see you here next time on Say What?